בוקר טוב, שבוע טוב. Our hero for today, Rav David Cohen. That's a very usual, typical Jewish name. However, the person that we are going to speak about is very unique and special, both in his Torah and in his lifestyle and in his aspirations. And as many other Jews, rabbis or not, at the end of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, he also had a challenging and tumultuous life journey. So, who was Rav David Cohen, Rav Nazir, and why do I think that his ideas are both very interesting and special, and also maybe at least relevant to our highest aspirations? So, Rav David Cohen, that was born as David Yehuda Aryeh Leib Cohen, but he seems to have somewhere along the way abandoned the additional names. So Rav David Aryeh Leib Cohen was born in Maishgula. Again, I apologize for the Maishgulians around us for the butchering of the city name. It was in Lithuania. What is important for us, it is part of the Russian Empire, nowadays Lithuania. And he's born to a very rabbinical family. His father is a Torah teacher. All of his uncles are rabbanim in certain yeshivot or cities. And his grandfather is Rav Zcharia Mendel Cohen Katz, who was the Rav of Radin. Now, in Radin, there was the famous yeshiva of the Chafetz Chaim. But the Chafetz Chaim was the Rosh Yeshiva. He was not the Rav of the city. The Rav of the city was the grandfather of our hero. There are some very interesting stories about the Chafetz Chaim who wanted to demonstrate to his students the honor that they should have to the local rabbi. I don't tell it for my own sake, just for you to know. So the Chafetz Chaim would send his wife with shailot about the kitchen, about kashrut, to the Rav of the city. And the wife would come to the Rav of the city, she would ask the question. And the Rav would say, you know, in the Mishnah Bura written by your husband, it is said so and so. So that was Rav Zcharia Mendel Cohen Katz. And Rav David Cohen was greatly affected by his grandfather. As a matter of fact, he has a type of autobiography that he wrote, not to be published, but for himself and his children, that he wrote about himself. And in it he says that when he was a young child, he was told by his parents that if he's to be asked, who is your favorite grandfather? He should say both. However, he said, I couldn't bring myself to lie, so I would be quiet when I would be asked that. So he really preferred his grandfather from his father's side, that was the Rav of Radin. He saw, again, he was niftar when he was there as a 10 years old child. But so it's not that he learned so much Torah in a deep sense from him, but his whole figure, it seems, was very majestic. And he really took that into heart. And he writes that many years later, when he would be debating, he would have internal fightings within himself. What should be his way in life? Then he would feel his grandfather letting him see, guiding him to the right path. That's his grandfather. There is in this diary, we may say, or autobiography, memories that he wrote about himself. Maybe I should be clear about that. He wrote a diary throughout main parts of his life, not from being a 6 years old child. So that was written later as a retrospective. When was this edition that was written later into the diary? It's difficult to know, but it seems that he wrote that during Milchemet HaAtzmaut. He was in Yerushalayim. Our story would take us, Be'ezrat Hashem, to there. So in 1948, he sits in Yerushalayim, and he is worried that he, Chas v'Chaila, would be killed, and he would not be able to tell his very young children who he was. So he writes for them, he is adding additions into the diary. So when they would read it, they would be able to know better their father. Baruch Hashem, he survived the war and lived for another 20 years. However, the additions remained in the diary, so we can benefit from them today. So in these additions to the diary, I would please share these pages. So again, he was born in 1887. So when he writes these two small sections that you are going to read, he's writing them in 1948, so he's 60 years old. So he is writing that with a certain perspective, obviously, on his life. And these are two little short memories that he thought would be important to understand his own life. So at the first source Aleph, that's again from his diary. ויהי באחד הלילות, one of these nights, אני בן 6, when I was 6 years old, בחלומי, he dreams. והנני עף מסביב ליציע העליון אשר בבית הכנסת, שהיה הולך מחדש ונבנה, אחר שרפת בית הכנסת הישן, ובטרם הגמרו, באין עוד מדרגות ליציע העליון. So he describes situation in his city was that the shul had burned down and they were in the process of rebuilding it. And it was not yet complete. So the first floor was already built, but the second one was yet in the building process. And in his dream, אני עף ושט סביב סביב באוויר בלי ערף. He's flying above this unfinished shul. לא אוכל לרדת מטה ולא לעלות מעלה. And I cannot go down to rest in the shul, but I also cannot fly up. אני עייף, and I'm very, very tired. עף ושט לאין סוף. And I'm flying and wandering endlessly. ויקץ. And then I woke up. So is it a dream? Is it a nightmare? והנה, now this obviously he adds, and he's 6 years old, הנה חלום חיי. This is the dream of my life. Meaning to say, this is a description of who I'm going to be. So he writes about himself when he needs to describe his life and pinpoint that to some point in his childhood. He says this dream of being torn between heaven and earth, between the shul that is now is being built and just flying up to heaven, and I cannot rest, neither there nor here. Oh, very interesting that he sees as the background, thank you, that his life should be read in contrast to. Again, in the same diary, the next paragraph, he writes about the first time he was taken to Vilna, the big city. Again, he's a few years old. בין הערים מסביב לה, עם עלות השחר, so when dawn was, הנה כל שריקת מכונת הרכבת הגיעה לאוזניי. Now again, you have to take yourself and be a child in some small city. There are no trains, of course. So for no cars, nothing to speak about. And for the first time, his father takes him, so we are in the end of the 19th century, and his father takes him to Vilna, and there to the railroad station. And for the first time, he hears the whistle of the train. And he says, והכל דק ורע, ממושך וארוך. So it was a high pitch, but very loud. ממושך וארוך, a long, prolonged sound. מלא געגועים. So again, so he says, it is full of longings. Now again, this is a very sensitive child being taken, and you know, many children hear the whistle of the train, the blow of the train, but I would guess that most of them would see it as a type of force, right, of strength, but he sees that as a sign of longing. So a very sensitive soul, obviously. מלא געגועים, נעלם, רחוק לאין סוף. So there is something here that is I see the train, but it's very distant, the sound that I hear. ויהי לי לזיכרון לכל הימים, את אשמע כל הצפירה של הרכבת, אותו קול מלא געגועים עזים בוקע באוזניי עד היום. So he writes that, 60 years old, he says, I can still hear the voice of the train blowing. ויהי לי ליסוד יצירת ההיגיון העברי השני. He says, that gave me the first. Now again, he writes it in perspective of 60 years later, 55 years later, but he says that was the foundation of my great project about which we are going to speak about. That is his main magnum opus, his main work, Kol HaNevuah, the voice of prophecy, or the sound of prophecy. And he says, this sound and the ability to listen, I learned there in the train station of Vilna. So I think, again, beautiful, and shows us a lot already about what type of person, very sensitive, very hearing person that he was already from a very young age. Now, his father is wandering around to make a living, for teaching, so he sends his son to learn basically by his uncles. So he's going from an uncle to an uncle. Sometimes the uncle himself teaches him, sometimes it's a melamed in the city. He's traveling a lot already in a very young age. And when he was 12, just one example again from the diary, then he was by one of his uncles, and he says that in the city that he was in, there were maskilim, enlightened. Now, again, the enlightened people back then are not necessarily what we call daskala, people that are non-observant. It can mean just people that know more than Gemara. If you knew more than Gemara, then you would be called an enlightened. You'd be called a maskil. So he says there were people there that were maskilim, and one of them, a woman, achat, soferet. So she was a writer. פרסמה מאמרים בהמליץ, and she was publishing articles in a newspaper, a periodical of the time called המליץ, in Hebrew. בבית דודי הרב, גיסותיו הבחורות היו שוקדות על הספרות העברית. So he says, and again, the young brides of my uncle. So these would be his cousins. So his girl cousins, his female cousins, learned Hebrew, and they would read Hebrew. And he was in the cheder, he was 12 years old, already almost bar mitzvah, and he knew Gemara, but he couldn't read. So he couldn't read Hebrew. Or he could obviously read Hebrew, but not as well as these girls could. So he felt, I guess, jealous and envy. And he said, אני התלמודי, I knew Talmud, יודע פחות מהם בשפת עבר וספרותה. I know less in Hebrew and Hebrew literature. התביישתי. I was ashamed. החילותי לקרוא בספרי הוצאת תושייה בלילות, so I began, so during the day, I was in the cheder, I had to learn Torah, but at night, he would make extra curriculum learning of Hebrew, ורוב המילים שלא ידעתי הוראתן, הייתי מנקב במחט בסימן. So he read books, Hebrew literature, and he had a pin, and each time he would see a word that he didn't know, he would punch a hole near the word, and he says the book became all nekavim, chalulim, chalulim. So he pinched almost all of the. I found it so interesting. When I was learning English, then we already had an Oxford dictionary. So I used an Oxford dictionary when I didn't know a word, and we were told by the teacher to have a small notebook where to write the words that we didn't know. My children already use electric devices, right? That you scan the word. They have this pen. Do you know what I mean? A pen scanner, and they scan the word, and it immediately appears on the screen the word that they are looking for. But back then, they didn't even have a dictionary. There was no dictionary. So you would pinch a word and would ask later, and you would be told what the word is. But in order to keep track of the words that he doesn't know, he would pinch a hole next to them. And then he says, already in the age of 12, I already began also to try to write my own articles. And I hope that I'll be able to mention it later. This whole question of women education was very important to him. So it seems that some of the seeds were already planted back then when he was 12 years old, and he saw his female cousins learn Hebrew, and he said, I have what to learn from them. Okay. He has his bar mitzvah, everything is fine, is nice. As I said, he was fortunate or unfortunate to be at the age of 10 at his grandfather in Radin when his grandfather passed away, and obviously that also made a great roshem, impression on the young sensitive boy. He continues to wander between yeshivot. It's unbelievable, by the way. Again, we spoke about that also last week. The extent that these young children would be allowed by their parents to wander all over Europe. I find it amazing. Very different world. Very different world. So it was, I think that from his birth to his bar mitzvah, he had more kilometrage then obviously I had throughout all of my life, but maybe even some of you are older and more experienced. So he was traveling all over Europe, back and again and back and again and back and again and back and again. Almost every year would change his yeshiva. That's also interesting. So in 1903, he goes back to Radin. He's already 16 years old. This time to learn, his grandfather has passed away, but he has his relatives there. And he goes to learn by the Chafetz Chaim. There he also gets the Musar, we may say the Musar virus, but that's maybe too negative, but it's positive, right? So he was infected, right, by Musar, and he begins to have like a small notebook, as a pinkas, in which he writes every time he does something that he sees as immoral. So he is having this list, and he's trying to perfect himself by recording each time of each of his failures. He's hoping to be able to improve himself. Then again, he goes to Slobodka. All of this time, it seems that, again, at night, from the side, he's still reading all of these Haskalah enlightened writers. And this time, it's already not only in order to learn Ivrit, but also because the content is interesting to him. And he even writes, he pens down an article when he's 16, where he argues that the Torah and Halacha are basically, in their approach, equal to the leading European culture of the day. Now, again, that's very premature, and he himself would not continue in exactly the same line, but you can see that he is very much interested in this clash, in the conflict between Yahadut and Western civilization. Is not singular in any way. Many people in Europe were asking these questions, but he is going throughout his lifetime to try to answer a very specific and interesting answer of his own, and this troubles him from a very young age. In 1907, so he's already 20 years old, and he abandons the yeshiva and goes to Kovna in order to prepare himself to the Bagrut exams of the Russian government. His parents were not exactly happy or excited, and he writes that he suffers there from great malnourishment, poverty. And in the end, he abandoned the plan. But again, you can see from here the importance that he sees to secular education. Then he returns and he begins to become a children teacher in the cheder. Now, he doesn't teach in a regular cheder, but in what was called back the cheder mitkadem, the progressive cheder. Now, what was the progressive cheder? So it was a cheder, but it was a little more similar to what we would call today an elementary school. So the children would be divided according to age, and there would be a curriculum, and there were goals to what you're supposed to learn, and the educators were supposed to be somewhat have more knowledge in pedagogy. And he himself took it to his heart, and he writes, again in his diary, he was reading works, both in Russian and in what he had in Hebrew, about how to teach well, and he's a very successful teacher. However, his family comes to him and basically says, you know, it's nice, but you are taking the engine of a tractor and you are using it for a car toy. All right, so you can do much better than that. Now, chas v'chayla, no one is underestimating the teaching of young children, but they say to him, you can write the books about how to teach the young children. So you can do much more than just be one teacher in one small city. Now, I'm not sure that what he did next was what they meant to push him to do, but what he does next is he decides that he would go to the Academy to Jewish Teachings of the Baron Ginsburg in St. Petersburg. Now, this was a very interesting institution that was ran and financed by the Baron. And in Hebrew, it was called the Machon Lemadei HaYahadut. In Russian, it was called, I of course cannot say the Russian, but the Institution for Eastern Learning. So not only Yahadut, maybe also it was against Ain Hara, against anti-Semitism. So they called it the Institution to Learn of the East. However, what they learned was Yahadut, but with scientific tools, similar and not similar to what was going at the same time in Western Europe, in Berlin. It was much more traditional than what was going in Berlin. As a matter of fact, the Baron at the beginning wanted to give a rabbinical ordination, but the Rabbanim asked him to refrain from doing so because it was not a typical classic yeshiva, and he obeyed the request. So they didn't give any rabbinical ordination there. And there he is able to stay for 4 years. So again, that's very interesting because in the yeshivot, he would jump from yeshiva to yeshiva every year. But in this institution where they learned in the scientific method, there he stayed for 4 years. He was extremely, extremely interested in philosophy. Extremely interested in philosophy. But there is one instance before we continue to speak about philosophy, because that would become his main thirst and focus in life. Then first we should mention that in his way to St. Petersburg, he stops by another relative he has, another uncle he has, in a small city called Luga. So he stops there, and let's just read from what he writes. It's in source Daled, very short. בבית דודי הרב, so at the house of my uncle, the רב, התעכבתי זמן ממושך, I delayed for a long time. כל הליכות הבית, הפשטות, הכנסת אורחים, משכו את... I enjoyed it really much. I was attracted by the simplicity, by הכנסת אורחים, by the guest welcoming, and so I enjoyed. בייחוד בת הרב, but I mainly enjoyed to meet the Rav's daughter. אז תלמידת הגימנסיה, then she was a student in the גימנסיה. So she's the daughter of the Rav, but she is going to basically a public high school. במידותיה הנאות, but by their beautiful midot, right, virtues, קנתה את ליבי לעדי עד. So she bought my heart, possessed my heart forever. Obviously, she would be a reoccurring guest in our play, in our story. But for now, is saying goodbye and continues to the Academy of the Baron Ginsburg.
How old is he at that point?
So that's 1909, 21. Oh, he was of age. He was of age. But wait, it's going to be a long story. So, as I said, he's learning basically mostly philosophy. He also learns Talmud. He learns Talmud, but his focus becomes more and more Jewish philosophy and also general philosophy. There he also learns to do it in an academic method, in which he is very different from almost all of the other Jewish thinkers that we are speaking here about, because most of them were autodidacts, and they learned by themselves. And as a consequence, as happens many times, they may be very original, very thoughtful, but not systematic, because they were able to read what they were able to put their hands on. Sometimes main literature, sometimes secondary literature, whatever they was available. Many of them didn't learn the languages needed in order to read things in their original, in their source. He made it a point of his, to the rest of his life, that everything he is learning and reading, he should read as close to the source that he can. And he learned many languages in order, now obviously he was skilled and gifted. He learned many languages in order to achieve that. And they describe many years later when he was teaching in Merkaz Arav in Yerushalayim, and he was teaching Arabic books that were written by our great philosophers in Arabic, then A, he himself knew, and B, he made sure that in his shiur always there would be someone that knows the old Arabic in order to be able to give him corrections when needed. So it was very important to him, learning things in their source. And that's part of the academic method that he acquired there in St. Petersburg. After 4 years, the academy is being closed by the Russian government because Baron Ginsburg passes away, Niftar, and without the political patron, then no one is able to make the academy sustain. So he decides to go and continue his philosophy learning in the Freiburg in Germany. Freiburg, thank you. Freiburg University. So he is going to Freiburg. In his way, he makes a stop in Luga. Won't he make a stop by his uncle? That would be extremely rude. So he stops in Luga, and again, he stays there for some time. And when he goes out, he's already me'oras to Sarah. Yeah, and they decide that they would get married in a year or so. But wait. So he is going to Freiburg to continue his philosophy learning. And also he stops in the way after stopping by his nephew, cousin, and now fiancé. He continues and also stops by Radin to speak with the Chafetz Chaim. And he has a very interesting and important discussion with the Chafetz Chaim. He stops there in order to be given by the Chafetz Chaim some Torah. He speaks about to be able to, we would say today in our language, to charge his battery before going to Goyish University to learn philosophy. However, the Chafetz Chaim speaks with him and doesn't understand why, about his uncles and how good they are in the rabbinical positions, and do they want to stay. And he writes, he didn't understand where Chafetz Chaim is trying to reach at. And then the Chafetz Chaim says to him, you come from a mishpachat kohanim. You're a Cohen. I am also a Cohen. He says, you should know, I don't know if I would live to see the beginning of redemption, he says to him, but I believe you will. So you need to prepare yourself to make aliyah, and to learn Kochim. You should learn every day, he says, at least a daf, a page from the Talmud of Kochim. And he sends him to buy a 1-volume Talmud Bavli. Now, Cohen doesn't write that, but I believe that was the way that the Chafetz Chaim wanted to charge his battery, right? By making this exceptions upon himself, that he would learn a daf a day at least, then he can go to learn in this university in Freiburg. But it also became very handy, as you would see in a few minutes. So he comes to Freiburg. In the journey, he stops in Berlin because he doesn't have the money just to continue in the train. So he had many problems. We cannot speak about everything at length. However, because he didn't have enough money to buy food, he becomes vegetarian. And as he becomes vegetarian, he also gets a few pages from a book that was written by Rav Kook. And in these pages, Rav Kook speaks about simchonut, about being vegetarian. And he speaks highly about it. He says the time is not right, but in itself, it's an ideal. And as he began his vegetarianism because of the need, now it became also an ideal. He understands that's something that he wants to continue with. And for the rest of his life, he wouldn't eat meat. And later he wouldn't eat fish. And later he wouldn't even wear leather shoes. So it's something that would develop. But that's a thread that now begins.
Can I ask
Yeah, for sure.
what is the reason? Because of animal cruelty?
Yeah, because not only cruelty, but because everything that was created by God has to be honored. That was his basic reason. That was his basic. He didn't eat on Shabbat. Rav Kook would. He didn't. That's right. And there would be some few more differences that would, Bezat Hashem, would unfold. Yes.
And does this relate in any way that there's no longer sacrifice in the Mikdash, and therefore there's no reason to eat meat now as well?
Yeah, I don't know if he writes that he has this this opposition to the time of Beit HaMikdash. He just says, I think he believed very highly that somehow in the future it would be solved.
Fine.
The problem of Beit HaMikdash and korbanot from the animals. So he becomes a vegetarian. He comes to Freiburg. He continues his high learning and mostly philosophy. As you said, he also learned botanics. Why? Because he wants to go to Eretz Israel, and there he hears you need to work the land. So he learns botanics. However, that's only a side learning, and his main issue is philosophy. He is connected to the Jewish community in Basel, in Switzerland, because later, no, I skipped, excuse me. In 1914, a year after he came to Freiburg, then the First World War breaks out. And if you're in Germany and you're a Russian citizen, you are sent, you are deported, basically. That's the good outcome that can come. So he's deported. During this deportation, he stops for a few months in some, I guess, deportation camp. And there he begins to learn Kabbalah from a Rav that he meets there. And the Kabbalah very much attract his mind. And from now on, he would make it part of what he's trying to do, to have this synthesis between Kabbalah and philosophy, but not a synthesis that means that both say the same, as many of the Jewish philosophers were trying to argue, but a two-tier system, if you want, Bezat Hashem, as we will continue. He continues his learning in Basel in Switzerland, and there he meets with the Jewish community and becomes a Maggid Shiur. He's giving Shiurim. How did he come to be a Maggid Shiur there? So that's the interesting story. He arrives there the first day, and he needs supper. So they say to him, we just finished Masechet Menachot in Shul. Come to the Shul, eat from the Siyum, and tomorrow we'll see what's going on. He comes to the Shiur, to the Siyum, and they finish Masechet Menachot. Now he knows Masechet Menachot by heart because Chafetz Chaim told him to learn a daf a day, and he already did a few rounds around, and and because he is very meticulous in everything he does, he learned it with all of the Pirushim that he was able to learn with, and he has a great mind. So he's sitting there, and they give the Siyum, and he gives them a whole lecture, completely unprepared, on Masechet Menachot from beginning to end. They were astounded by that. Knowing Masechet Menachot to every Rav it's not something simple, and he's not so young anymore, but pretty young, just coming in and giving a shiur out of nowhere without any preparation. So they were very impressed, and they made him the Maggid Shiur of the Shiur Daf Yomi. Also, it's hinted in his diary that the Rav there, called Rav Arthur Cohen, he seems to be a famous man over there, he looked for someone to give the Shiur Daf Yomi instead of him. So I guess it was a good deal for all sides involved. And from there on, he was giving the Daf Yomi Shiur. So he was giving, I don't know if Daf Yomi, but he was giving the Gemara Shiur. As he gives the Gemara Shiur, he was also given some payment. So it helped him, it helped the community. Everyone was happy. He was happy. And he continues in his philosophy learning in Basel. 1915, someone important come to Switzerland, and that is Rav Kook. Now, Rav Kook was also stranded outside of Eretz Israel during World War I, as I think we discussed already a few times. And the Rav Nazir read, as I said, a few things from Rav Kook. He thought he's a rabbi, he's an important rabbi, interesting rabbi. Not necessarily was interested in meeting him. He was pushed very heavily by one of his friends. The son of this Rav Arthur Cohen I spoke about was called Dr. Harav Marcus Cohen, Mordechai Marcus Cohen. And so he put some pressure on him to meet with Rav Kook. And in the end, Rav David Cohen agreed. And before meeting Rav Kook, he went to the... let's read inside. So say. ואני, so again, that's he writes many years later. אני בשוויץ בבאזל, עסוק בלימודי הדעות הפילוסופיות לתקופותיהן. So I was engaged, busy with learning philosophy to their different ages, to the different times, not necessarily Jewish philosophy, not at all Jewish philosophy, general philosophy. מלא צמאון ושקיקה לאמת. I was full of, he says, צמאון, thirstness, ושקיקה, and urging, maybe, desire, for the truth. בייחוד האמת הישראלית. And especially I was interested in the Jewish truth. Because I was learning general philosophy. And he would write it later. You can learn general philosophy. And he learned new philosophy. He learned Kant. He learned from Hermann Cohen. Not personally from Hermann Cohen, but they were very much, he was very much interested. He saw himself as, in a sense, as a student of Hermann Cohen, who was a great Jewish philosopher in Germany, and others. And when you compare that to what the Orthodox had to offer at the time, it was not equal, and not for the gain of the Orthodox side. And I am being gentle. So he says, I want to hear the truth of the Torah, but I don't see who can give it to me. So I'm learning general philosophy in order to be able at least to get as much of the truth as I can. And then הגיעה אליי השמועה מהרב שנמצא בארץ זו מזרחה. Then I heard that the Rav is here in Switzerland, a little more to the east. פניתי במכתב ובקבלי תשובה החלטתי לנסוע עליו. As I said, it was a little more complicated than that. It's not only that he sent a letter, he was pushed into sending it, but in the end, he decided to make the trip. אחרי הטבילה במימי הריין. So he made a tvila before meeting Rav Kook in the river. מצויד בשערי קדושה. And he took him with him a Kabbalah book, שערי קדושה. מלא ספק וחיקיון. I was full of doubt and longing. So he's doubting. Would something really go out of this meeting? עשיתי את דרכי לרב. בערב ראש חודש אלול באתי אליו. So I met with him in ערב ראש חודש אלול. מצאתי ועסוק בהלכה עם בנו. And צבי יהודה, רב צבי יהודה was with him, with Rav Kook, and they were speaking in הלכה. ונסבה שיחה על חוכמה יוונית וספרותה. So he says, I can only reconstruct, but he says, when I entered, we began to speak about Greek philosophy. I would guess that Rav Kook asked him, where do you come from? What do you learn? And he told him that he learns philosophy. So Rav Kook spoke with him about philosophy. And the Nazir writes, that's amazing. He writes, לא סיפקה עוד נפש היודעה ממקורותיה הראשונים. He says, to be honest, I was not very impressed with what Rav Kook had to offer. Because I knew the philosophy ממקורותיה. I read it in Greek. I read it in Latin. I knew from Aristotle to Kant and later. And Rav Kook almost certainly didn't know Greek. He didn't know Greek. He didn't know Latin. What Rav Kook learned some of this philosophy, as I said, from secondary literature. So it was not very impressive. He's very honest. החלטתי לישון שם, נשארתי ללון אצלם. So I decided that anyway it was late. I would just remain to sleep, and tomorrow morning I would be back to Freiburg. To Basel. על משכבי לא שכב ליבי. However, I couldn't sleep. I was asleep, but my heart was not asleep. גורל חיי היו על כפות המאזניים. My destiny, my fate, was on the scales. והנה בוקר השכם, ואשמע כל צעדים עינה ועינה. So suddenly I'm being waked up, or maybe couldn't sleep, by steps going from one end of the room to the other. בברכות השחר, תפילת העקידה, בשיר וניגון עליון, משמי שמי קדם, וזכור לנו אהבת קדמונים. Rav Kook stood up early and began to say ברכות השחר and קורבנות. And he was doing it with his own, he had a special nigun Rav Kook had. Now, we are being told by the other students of Rav Kook that Rav Kook did not have a great voice of singing. So we do not speak here about the melodies. We speak here about something else that Rav David Cohen is able to hear, maybe just as he heard in the whistle of the train. והנה נהפכתי והייתי, והקשיב, I heard, והנה נהפכתי והייתי לאיש אחר. And I became a different man. אחרי התפילה מיהרתי לבשר במכתב, after תפילה, I was very quick to write a letter back to Basel, כי יותר מאשר פיללתי, מצאתי. More than I asked for, I did find. מצאתי לי רב. I found, not because of what Rav Kook was able to teach him in philosophy. Rav David Cohen was able maybe to teach Rav Kook in philosophy. Again, to be just honest. But when I heard, he says, his tefillah, I knew that this is the person that I want to cling to. So very, very interesting. And from there on, Rav David Cohen would become one of the most affluent students of Rav Kook. Now, Rav Kook himself went back to Eretz Israel after the end of the First World War. He stopped by in England, in London, but he came back to Eretz Israel. And Rav David Cohen remains in Basel, continuing his learning in philosophy. He is about to finish his doctorate already. But he feels very bad with himself. I'm reading now from the source Vav. This is from these years between the end of the First World War, 1917 and 1921, in which he's still in Basel. הנני הומה, בטני הצקתני כסיר נפוח. So my stomach is hurting, I feel like a סיר נפוח. I don't know even how to translate that. He's feeling like he's about to explode. אבל לא אטעם, but I cannot eat. So I'm hungry, but I cannot eat. Something is going on, but it's not physical. הנני נרקב פה. Says, I am here in Basel, beautiful city, I think we would agree. Says, I feel that I'm rotting here. יום ליום ירדוף, מה לי פה? What am I doing here? He writes it in his own personal diary. What am I doing here? היום זה 4 שנים שנסעתי It's already 4 years from when I met with Rav Kook. והנה עכשיו הוא בעיר הקודש. Now he returned to ירושלים. ונפשי צמאה, לא תמצא מנוחה, and my soul is thirsty, and I cannot find rest. הקדושה שאליה תשתוקק, בעינויים וסיגופי הגוף, בזהירות, לא תגיע אליה. I desire to holiness, and my body suffers, I refrain from doing things, I do not have pleasures, I don't eat meat. He stopped to cut his hair. So he was like a Nazir. He had his hair. They say that in certain points his hair came to his knees. So he's doing his best, he feels, to have this, we would call it maybe mystic experience of meeting with Hashem. He says, that's not the place. I'm in the wrong place. הנני טובל ושרץ בידי. I'm like someone going to the mikvah holding a vermin. So it's not going to work. I won't be able to purify myself this way. החדר שאני גר בו הוא קברי. The room where I reside is not a place of residence, of a live residence. It's a place of grave. I feel my room where he studies philosophy is a grave. Now, just feel, you remember the dream? Flying, and he cannot stay, he cannot rest down, but he cannot go up. So this is the feeling he's speaking about, because he stays there in Basel. So he is being obviously attracted to what is being taught in the university. On the other hand, he feels that his real goal, his real destiny is there in the Levant, in Yerushalayim. And what about that? Finally, someone remembers. Finally. She still is fiancé back then, back in Luga. by the way, her parents are sending him letters. No. And he answers, I don't have yet the money, I don't have yet the ability, but he writes in the diary, I was not ready yet. I was still building myself, and I was not able yet to make a covenant with another soul, which is, on the one hand, I guess is beautiful. On the other hand, when you think about her staying there,
he had a deal for a year.
Yeah, the deal for a year, right? We are already, well, already 7 or 8 years later. Wow, yeah. So he says, he says, I have many problems with all the women going around. Now, again, I guess he was a young man, and Switzerland was not necessarily the stronghold of modesty, and he felt that the whole place is not right to him. By the way, we have a testimony, we asked about his fiancée, that he had a picture of her on his desk throughout the whole time. So that's at least a 1 point to his merit, I guess. Yeah. He says, לא אמצא מנוח, here I won't be able to find my rest. נוס מפה, אל תצפה לשם דוקטור, he says to himself, right? He writes to himself, run away, don't wait to be crowned as a doctor. Now, he worked for that already for almost 8 years, 7 years. But he says, that's not the place. Don't be naive here. תהי תמים there. Be naive in ירושלים. אשלך על השם יאהבך, והיה אם גם שם תהיה מלחמה תנצח, ותזכה if you'd have a war there you'd win, and you would win, and then there are 3 dots. Now, we can almost certainly make here what is missing, and that is תזכה לנבואה. Because he was now already aspiring to what would become the goal of his life, and that is to receive prophecy, to receive nevuah. And for that, he began to develop this system of his, that there is a difference between the Jewish logic, if the logic is the right, logic is not the right word, and if you want, the Western logic. The Western, I would say it now in one sentence, extremely simplifying. If you want, you have a whole sefer here, and much more. But very, very basically, he says that the Greek or the Western logic is built upon seeing, but the Jewish logic is built upon hearing. We do not see. לא ראיתם תמונה. We hear. Now, there are many ways to explain the difference. Again, you need to read the whole thing, and even then, I would admit that it's extremely, extremely difficult to understand. He writes in a very difficult way. But what I, in my very small understanding, was able to decipher, I think, is the difference between seeing and hearing. Hearing is much more active. Seeing is passive. There is the object, and you see it, and it's there. Hearing, you don't have the object. You need to create it in your imagination. For us, you can say it's the difference between reading is like hearing, for that sense. There is no reading is hearing. When you read a book, right, a romance, something, then when you read it, you have to imagine. When you see a movie, it's much more relaxable, right? Because someone else took the hard work of imagining. You just need to absorb. So listening is much more active. And as a consequence, listening is creating comments. I would explain what I just said. That's his own mashal. He says, when a Greek sage looked at the heavens, he saw stars. And he began to ask himself, what are these stars? How they are moving? What are the forces that are moving them? Very important questions, which are the basis to our science. After many gilgulim, right? Changings. However, when the ancient Jew was looking at the stars, he was looking at the stars and he said, the stars are singing the praises of God. He was not looking, he was hearing the stars speaking. When you hear something, it's something that is being said to you. Something that is being said to you is something that is commanding you. You can see a scene and you can describe it. And you can see a scene, the same scene, and it would be a call for action. For the Jew, everything he sees, he doesn't really see. The Jew always hears. So he sees something, but he really hears the voice of Hashem telling him what to do. And at its highest, this skill is kol hanevuah, that is the voice of prophecy. The voice of prophecy is the ability to see the word, but instead of seeing with our eyes, hearing God with your ears. That's, now again, I obviously very, very much oversimplified it, but that's the basic concept to my poor understanding. So, obviously he cannot stay in Basel, but he does stay. And he cannot stay, and he does stay until 1921. 1921, finally, there was also a problem of certificate. Even when he finally decided that he would make Aliyah, he needed a certificate. Only certificate was the rishayon, right? The permit from the British mandate to make Aliyah. And in 1921, on Rosh Hashanah, he's in shul, and a messenger comes in and tells him that he received the certificate. On Tzom Gedalia, he's already on his way. By the way, from Basel, they went to Israel in trains, not by ship, not by sea. It's very, I don't know, I guess it was safer, maybe even shorter. Yeah, but they just went through all of Europe, basically. And Orient Express, exactly, it was the Orient Express. And they reached through Rosh Hanikra. The old who visited there knows that there was a train from Lebanon, from Turkey to Yerushalayim. So he's using this train, and he comes first to Yafo and then to Yerushalayim, and there he meets with Rav Kook, and he says there already his will, as I said, was to get nevuah. His mission life is having nevuah, and the only question is how. And he is looking for ways. Now, I know that you're waiting for that, so I'm taking a break from Nevuah for a second. When he reaches Eretz Israel, he sends a letter to his fiancée in Luga saying, he involved Rav Kook. Rav Kook was able, because Rav Kook was already the Rav Rashi, so Rav Kook was able to get a certificate for his fiancée, and his fiancée comes. However, when she comes, as I said, Rav David Cohen was now called the Rav Nazir because of his hair, because of his refraining from meat and wine now also. So Rav Nazir would also take upon himself many, many weeks of silence. he wanted to improve his ability to listen. Right? We speak about, if you want to listen to Hashem, the first thing you need to do is to that's the problem of rabbis. I am speaking. When do I have time to listen? And he took, so for 40 days, between Rosh Chodesh Elul and Yom Kippur, he would be silenced completely. Even he didn't speak in Torah. He just wrote notes. And at other times, very frequently, you take a week here, a week there, every Erev Rosh Chodesh, if I remember correctly. So many, many, many times during the year, for the rest of his life, he would take ta'anit dibur and would not speak. And his fiancée came when he was in one of these ta'aniyot. Now, Rav Kook forced him to have a beidin and to do a tarat nedarim and to cancel, at least for this specific time, his vow. But so halachically, okay, the vow was annulled. However, I guess that's he couldn't. So there is a heartbreaking description. Now he was extremely happy seeing her, and all the descriptions are equal about that. And she was extremely happy to see him. And according to the recording we have of someone that wrote, then Rav Kook put them together to sit and speak in the house of Rav Kook and his wife serving them. And Rav Kook's wife put foods in front of the guest, in front of of Sarah, who just came. And Rav David sat opposite to her and said, "No," and gestured to the foods. And she looked at him and said, "What, no?" And he said, "No." And then she told him, "You told me that you would speak, otherwise I'm leaving." It's 12 years after they were before. I'm leaving. So he said, "Ichli, eat." It was, I guess it was even stronger than what he was able to overcome. And again, I can try to feel it, psychologize. We can speak about maybe he was feeling the tension between, he knew that he wants to marry her, but he also wants to have this spiritual connection, and he was asking himself, would that be contradiction? And Rav Kook really forced him into speaking. That's how what we have says. And then she went to Rebbetzin Kook, and she wanted to get her advice. Should she marry this man? This man maybe went completely off the tracks, and and there's no one to speak with. And the Rebbetzin promised her that he is a very fine man. The days of silence would cease, and she would see that he is the perfect match for her. And really, they were. It's beautiful. Really, they were. Now they got married already in somewhat of an older age, and I don't know how much time they were basically together, because obviously he had many time of pre-shoot in which he took himself to the desert because he wanted to see, maybe just as the Nevi'im were given the prophecies sometimes in the desert, he should go to the, so he went for a month to Midbar Yehuda to live in a cave and different other experiences till he decided, and that's also he writes in his diary, that Nevuah comes according to the age. And at the age of miracles, the way to receive Nevuah was going by the desert, going to the desert. At the age of science, the way to receive Nevuah is by learning the science of Nevuah. And that's what made him write this Sefer, Kol HaNevuah, which is a try of a system, attempt at a philosophical system of what Nevuah is, trying to recruit all the knowledge that he had of modern, ancient, modern, Jewish, every type of philosophy that he knew, and he knew a lot into that. There's a lot more to speak about because that's only half of his life. He begins. He sits in Yeshivat Merkaz Harav. He becomes a teacher in Merkaz Harav. Basically, he teaches Machshava Yehudit, Jewish thought or Jewish philosophy. Some of his shiurim later were printed. Some of them were edited by my wife, Pnina's father, Professor Dov Schwartz, my father-in-law. So he, as a relatively young man, so that was his first scientific work, was to edit the Perush of Rav Nazir on the Kuzari. So that's just as a side note, a personal connection. He's sitting there in Yeshivat Merkaz Harav. He's teaching. His hair is becoming longer, but he also has many experiences in his diary. There are recorded some experiences that he has that are very close to Ruach HaKodesh, to Nevuah. But he was feeling that he's having advance. He's advancing in his strive for Nevuah. In 19, I'm skipping very much ahead. 1948, obviously, Milchemet HaAtzmaut, War of Independence. He has two children with his wife, a boy and a girl. The boy is called Sha'ar Ishuv Cohen. The girl is called Tzfiya, meaning waiting for, which obviously is both is waiting for. Nevuah is both the parents waiting one for the other. Expectancy, right? That's, I guess, the better translation. So Tzfiya. And his daughter is marrying Rav Shlomo Goren. And his son, Rav Sha'ar Ishuv Cohen, would become later the Rav Arashi of Haifa. So both of his children are very famous. His son was already 18 years old at the time of 1948. He was a part of the Machteret, Brit HaChashmonaim, which was like a religious, I guess, a religious Machteret under movement against the British. And later on, his son was a warrior in Milchemet HaAtzmaut, and when the Jewish quarter of Yerushalayim fell to the Jordanian, then he was taken as a prisoner and swept only in a deal after the war. So he was very heavily involved with, he was a great believer, the Talmud of Rav Kook was a great believer in the Jewish revival, in the Jewish political revival. He believed that it is a necessary step in order also to revive Nevuah, because you need a Jewish state, you need a Jewish culture, you need an independent Jewish world in order to produce Jewish independent thought that would not only be a guest on the table of others, as he learned in Basel, but would stand on its own feet. And so he was also part of that. He wrote letters and psakim that Bnei Yeshiva must be recruited. That's also very interesting. Again, we can read that, but we don't have, unfortunately, we don't have the time. However, he is extremely disappointed in the end of the Independence War. That he's extremely happy, obviously, for the establishment of Medinat Israel, but he is torn because the Kotel is not does not belong to Am Israel. Har HaBayit does not belong to Am Israel. Me'arat HaMachpelah does not belong to Am Israel, and he makes another vow that he won't get out of his house until these places are liberated and come back to Am Israel. Now, that's after, who would believe that it would happen even in his lifetime? But as you know, only 19 years later, in Milchemet Sheshet HaYamim, these places were liberated, and his son-in-law, Rav Goren, who was the Rav of Tzahal at the time, made sure that he would be of the first people to come to the Kotel. So he sent a jeep, a military jeep, to the house of his father-in-law. They took Rav Nazir, took Rav David Cohen, and they drove him to the Kotel. And we have a testimony about how he attached himself to the wall, and for an hour you couldn't distinguish between him and the wall. And that's obviously it was a beautiful moment. And in 1969, after about 30 years of work, he publishes this. This was supposed to be the first of 3 volumes of his great work on prophecy. Unfortunately, in his lifetime, only the first volume was printed. They say that there are still many manuscripts that are waiting to be worked upon, but his writing is extremely difficult because he believed, as I said, that one, in the Jewish thought, one should listen and not see, meaning that he cannot just write to you to be in plain sight. That's why the Jewish logic system is one of midrash. You need to listen carefully to what is written. Now, it's extremely difficult. I myself have gone only a very, very few pages of this work, and most of what I just told you, and he would hate me for saying that, but was from secondary literature that analyzed, as of my father-in-law, that analyzed the work of Rav David Cohen. So it's important, I guess, to also admit that. In 1972, Kafchet Av, 1972, he was niftar and was buried in Har HaZeitim. Now, I just one or two more minutes about his legacy. So, on one hand, you may say he almost has no effect. Why? Because his book is extremely difficult to read, and you don't see. He had many students in Merkaz Harav, but you don't see him going around and telling what did they learn from the Rav Nazir. So content-wise, it seems it was extremely difficult to decide what exactly he wanted to say. And I have a suspicion that maybe he himself, and he would admit it, didn't know exactly what he's trying to say. It was a work in development of re-revealing the Jewish spirit. It's something that is still evolves. On the other hand, it is obvious that he was a very central figure in this movement in Yeshivat Merkaz Harav of seeing the Jewish political revival also as Jewish spiritual revival. And by that, he was extremely influential on many, many things that developed later, who sees our being here not only as a place to run away from anti-Semitism, but as an opportunity and a gift from Hashem to reclaim and to regain Jewish original Torah, Jewish original culture, Jewish original spirituality, and finally and eventually, Be'ezrat Hashem, also the ability to hear and to listen to the voice of Hashem speaking to us. So thank you very much, and Be'ezrat Hashem would continue next week.
Can I ask a question?
For sure.
I know it's late, so but two